they might be driving around town trying to find that one parking space that's still open. So we'll try to get them in as we can. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Joanna Hahn. I'm the Central Region Director for the Indiana State Museum and Historic Sites, and I have the pleasure of managing the Levi and Catharine Coffin State Historic Site, and been here for just over 5 years. Very excited for tonight's program, but before I get into some introduction, I just want to say thanks to the Wayne County Foundation, who has supported our programming this fiscal year and is kind enough in supporting this program specifically. So I appreciate, hi Jim, come on in. I appreciate their support and allowing us especially to bring Max all the way from North Carolina to come and join us. So one little detail about tonight's program in case you haven't seen it on Facebook. But unfortunately, Max's co-presenter, Adrienne Israel, is unable to be with us tonight. She came down ill this week, and the doctor encouraged her not to travel, and she took that advice. And so we hope that she gets better. But I may try to arrange something separate with Adrienne. It may have to be something virtual, because like Max, she's in North Carolina. So Max is going to do his best to talk a little bit of the information that she was going to present. They have co-presented before, he is familiar, but if you may have a question that might be more towards Adrienne, I'm sure he'll let you know that she would be the best to follow up. But just before I bring Max up, I just want to say that one of the key components that we do here at the Levi and Catharine Coffin State Historic Site is we were really focused on the lives of Levi and Catharine from 1826 to 1847, because that's when they called Fountain City home. But their story and their marriage and their anti-slavery work is a lot larger than just those 20 years. And one of the things that I've always been sort of fascinated by and learning more about is really what have been their influences and what really encouraged them to carry on this work even when they came to Indiana and then years later when they went to Cincinnati. So I've been following Max and Adrienne for the past couple of years. The nice thing with COVID is a lot of people went virtual with their talks and programs and such, and so that allowed me to hear them speak, and so I really wanted to take the opportunity to bring them here, and I'm glad that we're at a point where we're finally able to do that. So without further ado, I want to invite Max to come up and speak. If you're not, I know some of you are even related to Max, so you can know a little better than I do. But Max is out of Guilford County, North Carolina. Is retired now from Guilford College, where he's professor of religion, correct? Mm-hmm. Do you have title of emeritus now?
That's got to go through the board of trustees,
okay,
and they're never going to make me emeritus.
To that level or not? So
well, I have to tell you, Elton Trueblood, wonderful, esteemed, late professor at Earlham, refused to be named emeritus when he retired, because he said, in the Latin, E means out, and meritas means deserves to be. So he was professor at large.
Okay. All right, well, good luck with that.
Okay.
So I'm going to turn it over to Max, and then when he's done speaking, we will open the floor to questions and answers. Okay?
Great.
All right, go for it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. We came a little early to hang out with family. I grew up in Rusheville in Howard County, and we've had opportunity to get together with family, and some of my relatives are here now. I assume to check back in with the folks back in Rusheville to see how their kin did, but I checked them for tomatoes to make sure. I always speak outside of tomato season so that it's not tossed. But wonderful to see relatives and friends and colleagues, and thanks so much for being here this evening. Now, coming to speak about Levi and Catharine Coffin at the Coffin Historic Site is a little bit like taking coals to Newcastle. But I know that Newcastle's 25 miles that way. And we have people here from Newcastle. But as was introduced, the purpose this evening is to give some context for what shaped Levi and Catharine Coffin before they got to Indiana. And there was quite a history before they got here in 1826. So that's the focus, as what was that community like in New Garden that they came out of and formed New Garden, meeting here, carrying their names, Randolph County, Wayne County, Henry County. Again, as I often tell people, if you go along US 40, engineered, surveyed by a Quaker, Jonathan Knight, you're driving through North Carolina. The surnames are the same, the meetings there's even a Greensboro along there. So there was a place they came from, and what I hope to do this evening is give you, some sense of what that place was, what shaped that place, and how that place shaped Levi and Catharine Coffin. Now, when I was growing up in Indiana, we often talked about how Indiana shaped Lincoln and made Lincoln, and Lincoln made Illinois. And that's what we want to focus on here. I don't know that the Coffins made Indiana, but we know what made Levi and Catharine Coffin down in their neck of the woods. And now my wife and I live a mile from where they lived along Horsepin Creek, a mile from where they attended New Garden Meeting, a mile from where Levi's grandparents are buried. And in fact, I brought along a little book about the New Garden Cemetery. It's available for $10 at the intermission, no, at the end of the presentation. But on the cover are William and Priscilla Coffin, proudly born in Nantucket, which we'll talk about in a moment. But that will be available later on if you want to get some of the backstory of all the other players in this drama. So we've taken quite an interest in the Coffins and quite often lead tours through that cemetery, through the Underground Railroad woods. We run, my wife runs, I hobble along the trail by Horsepin Creek, and you really can sense the presence of not only that Quaker community that settled there, and we'll talk about where they came from, but also the fugitives who hid out in those woods. And if you've read the reminiscences, you know the stories, that there's a physical sense there of what happened, and we'll try to paint some of that picture this evening. Well, the first settlement of Quakers in North Carolina was 350 years ago. We're celebrating the 350th anniversary this year of the gathering of the first Quaker communities in North Carolina in 1672. There were a few Quakers who filtered into North Carolina ahead of that to get away from being hanged in New England. It was a capital offense to be caught driving while Quaker in Boston. But you couldn't necessarily settle in Virginia. The Cavaliers and the Church of England would get you. So you filtered over into the Great Dismal Swamp. And if you know anything about the history of the Underground Railroad and anti-slavery, the Great Dismal Swamp was a place that Maroons hid out in because you can't find you there. And if you could, the mosquitoes would get you. But there were Quakers already settling in the Great Dismal Swamp of eastern North Carolina by 1665. But two of the founders of Quakerism, at least the person who brought Quakerism to Ireland, William and Edmondson, and George Fox, one of the early leaders of the Quaker movement, themselves came to eastern North Carolina in 1672. And we don't have the time to get into it, but it was a pathless wilderness. And they wandered in there and found the Henry Phelps family somehow, who had already gotten there, and later on held public meetings in May for William Edmondson and November for George Fox that gathered significant numbers of people who were convinced of the Quaker message. And again, we don't have time to go into all of it, but there were several reasons that Quakerism was attractive to the North Carolina backcountry. For one, they didn't have any ordained clergy. Quakerism at the time worshiped in silence. You had no outward sacraments, so you needed no ordained clergy. And what ordained clergy trained at Yale or Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge would have bothered to go to the Great Dismal Swamp to ply their trade? It was a simple faith. You didn't have to have elaborate churches. You could gather on logs in the silence, as New Garden Meeting did initially in 1751. And you had, again, none of the falderall, as my great aunt would have called it, of all those church trappings. It was a very simple faith, so very attractive to backcountry folk. And you didn't have to serve in the militia because it was a pacifist, it was a non-resistant group. And you didn't have to pay church tithes because you didn't have an ordained clergy. Pretty attractive to folk. So anyway, large groups of friends gathered, and by the end of the 1600s, believe it or not, the Carolinas were a Quaker colony. Had a Quaker governor, John Archdale, a majority Quaker assembly, the first organized, although we're hardly organized today, first organized religion of European descent, Christian religion in the Carolinas was Quaker. North Carolina Yearly Meeting, 1698. The first public school, Simon's Creek, was established by Quakers as a public school. They found a way to get rid of us eventually out there, at least getting rid of us in the government. They just required a loyalty oath. Quakers won't swear an oath, so we were out of government, but we remained. So for a long time, the center of Quakerism in North Carolina was out there in the east, along the seacoast, Pasquotank, Perquimans counties. Pretty significant because that's flatland. Now you may think of North Carolina as rolling or the Smoky Mountains, but and glaciers never got down there. But the eastern third of North Carolina is flat because it used to be the seabed. The Blue Ridge was the seacoast millions of years ago. So it's plantation territory. That's where the plantations were because of the topography, because of the richness of the soil. So Quakers who lived out there were enslavers. There were plantations. We'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But the Coffins didn't come from there. They came from the Piedmont, the central part of North Carolina, where we live there, halfway in between the rivalry between UNC and Duke in the Triangle, and the Demon Deacons of Wake Forest. I don't know what it is about Tobacco Road, but at one point, there were the Demon Deacons at a Baptist school, there were the Fighting Quakers at a Quaker school, the Fighting Christians at a UCC college at Elon, and the Blue Devils of that Methodist Flats over there in Durham. Interesting piece of the history there. But there in the Piedmont, it's fairly rolling. The topography isn't plantation-like. So that was one thing. But more significantly, what attracted Quakers into the Piedmont much later, in the 1740s and 1750s, was what was going on in Nantucket and Pennsylvania. The Quakers who settled in the Piedmont first came down the Philadelphia Wagon Road in the 1740s because it was getting crowded in southeastern Pennsylvania. Daniel Boone, one of our fine disowned Quakers, once said, if you can see the smoke from a neighbor's chimney, it's already too crowded. And it was getting crowded up there. And it was getting expensive. There was land you couldn't buy for less than 5 cents an acre. There's a geographic problem. You couldn't go too far west. You hit the Appalachians. You hit the Allegheny Mountains. I don't know why they didn't take the tunnels on the turnpike, but they didn't. You hit those mountains. And there was war going on out there. The 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And it was, so you hit those barriers, you bore left, you went down through the Shenandoah Valley, establishing towns all along the Lynchburg, Virginia, for example, is a Quaker-founded city. But eventually you got down into the Piedmont, which, like eastern North Carolina, was very attractive to Quakers. It was the backcountry. It wasn't claimed by Native Americans, which was important for early Friends, because the Tuscarora Wars had pretty much eliminated Indian claims to that area. And so Quakers started filtering in to the Piedmont, establishing Cane Creek Meeting in 1749. The first gathering at New Garden was 1751 on 3 fallen logs with their horses in the middle. Became an official monthly meeting in 1754. Deep River Center, and old enough that it's still spelled C-E-N-T-R-E, meeting in southern Guilford County. And a large population of Friends gathered in the 1740s, 50s, and the 60s. Now, significantly came from Pennsylvania, not just because of what was going on up there, but because, again, as I mentioned before, Quakers were enslavers. There's quite a little bit of controversy right now about William Penn, because William Penn was an enslaver. He enslaved a number of people to help build Pennsbury Manor north of Philadelphia. And so his name is getting taken off of some Quaker institutions. William Penn House in Washington, D.C., William Penn Room in a friend's house in London. His statue is safe on top of City Hall in Philadelphia because you can't get up there, except when the Phillies are in the World Series and a baseball cap appears on his head somehow or other. But he was an enslaver. But there were Quakers already in the 1680s beginning to agitate towards a more enlightened understanding of applying those Quaker testimonies of equality and peace and integrity to this institution of slavery. One of the first significant addressing of that issue was 1688 in Germantown. Formerly Mennonites had become Quakers in the Palatinate through the work of William Penn, George Keith, George Fox, and Robert Barclay. And those Quakers now came over on the Concorde without the E on the end of it. It wasn't a supersonic jet, but came over on the Concorde boat in 1683, the first German settlers in North America. And having escaped persecution themselves in Europe, looked around and couldn't believe that Quakers were persecutors themselves, that they were enslavers. So 4 of them gathered in a home on Germantown Avenue in 1688 and penned a 2-page protest against slavery. You can look it up, you can Google it, the Germantown Remonstrance. And it's simply based on the Golden Rule. Would any of you want to be enslaved? No. Then why are we doing this to others? Well, if you know anything about Quaker polity, you have to reach unity in Quaker business meetings. You don't vote in Quaker business meetings. There's a truth that can be known. If we gather in silence and wait on the Spirit, we'll be led into unity because there's objective truth. Now, slavery is an economic engine. People are invested in this. And so people have got a dog in this fight. And Quakers at the time enslaved persons at a higher rate than anyone else in Philadelphia because they were first there. They had the goods and they didn't want to give up their advantage. So that protest went to the monthly meeting, went nowhere. They kicked it up the road to quarterly meeting, went, no, we can't reach unity. Kicked up the yearly meeting, lasted almost a century. Quakers take a long time sometimes to make decisions. But it began that conversation. By 1693-94, George Keith, one of those Quakers, had penned a protest against slavery just before he left Friends and went back to the Church of England. One of the significant figures up there in Pennsylvania, though, was Benjamin Lay. And if you ever get a chance to read Marcus Rediker's The Remarkable Benjamin Lay, the 4-foot-tall hunchback dwarf who supposedly lived in a cave. I've heard that it was really a cottage next to an opening in a little hill north of Philadelphia. He had been a sailor for 17 years, had witnessed the worst of the slave trade and the Caribbean plantations, and became an ardent abolitionist. And again, tried to convince friends to get out of this business of slavery. And again, they wouldn't listen. He would protest, and they would again say, well, it's a matter of too grave a concern, we can't reach unity on this. So he began using guerrilla theater tactics. I can't go into all of them. One of his most famous ones was after another gathering of friends had refused to adopt an anti-slavery testimony, he went out of the meeting, came back later with his gray Quaker overcoat, not very long, he was only 4 foot tall, but covering a military uniform. And he strode to the front of the room and tossed off this jacket, revealing this military uniform with the brass buttons and a sword in a scabbard at his side, carrying a Bible in the crook of his arm. And he drew the sword out and plunged it into this Bible that he had previously hollowed out and put a pig's bladder full of red berry juice in. And the blood of the violence of slavery splattered all over the plain friends gathered, and he was tossed out of the meeting. He was disowned, I think, by 3 meetings. After Marcus Rediker wrote his book 10 or 15 years ago, he's being reinstated in all those meetings now. So posthumously, he is now a fine friend. But he didn't gain traction. Again, remember, slavery is an economic engine, and people are invested in this thing. But he kicked the door open for others like John Woolman, who used more gentle tactics, going person to person to person, saying, we as Quakers have a problem here. This is inconsistent with what we believe, that slavery is a sin, and it's not only impacting the enslaved person, but you too, your own soul. And how about your children who will be raised in luxurious standards on the back of oppressed and labor and misapplied power? How about them? But his gentle ways, and again, you can look into any number of writings about John Woolman, his gentle, persuasive ways, refusing hospitality, for example, in Quaker slave owning homes, when he found out that the hospitality was being offered on the backs of oppressed labor. Here, come on in, John. You've walked all the way from New Jersey to North Carolina to speak to these slave owners, and you must be tired, so come in and have a drink. So, well, who prepared the beverage? Well, I can't. Well, then at least go up and have a rest on who made the bed? And if it was enslaved, I can't do that. He would either pay for the hospitality or go out into the slave quarters. And that act so embarrassed many Quaker enslavers that they gave it up. If we can't host someone so transparently spiritual as John Woolman, we've got to get out of this business. By the 1750s, his witness and his writings had led Philadelphia Yearly Meeting to at least adopt testimonies prohibiting the buying and selling and importation of slaves, but not yet an anti-slavery testimony. But he kept working it. And then Anthony Benezet came along, who himself had been a refugee from persecution in France. He was a Huguenot with his family, became a Quaker, opened one of the first Negro schools in North America in the 1730s, and was a passionate opponent of slavery and abuse of Indians, and he welcomed the Acadians in who'd been driven out of Nova Scotia. I mean, amazing guy, Anthony Benezet. He was probably even more effective with his anti-slavery witness than Woolman was. Woolman was effective inside the Society of Friends. Benezet published widely. In fact, his work influenced the Wesleys, who influenced John and Charles Wesley, who influenced the anti-slavery movement in England. It's said that the North Atlantic abolitionist movement wouldn't have existed without Anthony Benezet's work. So I say all that to let you know what's happening in southeastern Pennsylvania. That's where those first settlers in New Garden came from. So they've been steeped in that kind of activism, that kind of witness. Then they were followed by Quakers from Nantucket, peaking in around 1772. Now, what's going on in Nantucket? Well, it's a largely Quaker community. They're mostly whalers, sailors, and the island's getting crowded. The whales are going farther and farther out to sea, so there are economic reasons to leave, demographic reasons to leave, kind of like in Pennsylvania. But there was also a very active anti-slavery society already established there in 1733. They were sailors. They had also, like Benjamin Lay, seen the worst of this trade in human bodies. And dozens and dozens of those Nantucket families came, followed their Pennsylvania spiritual brethren, and settled in Piedmont, North Carolina. And those were the Coffins, and the coffee names, the Starbucks and the Folgers, the department store folk, the Macy's, the Stanleys, the Swains, the Gardners. And you have been, by the time of the Revolutionary War, and we won't get into all of that adventure, some of that's in here, you had a large Quaker community in Piedmont, North Carolina, at New Garden, at Deep River, at Cane Creek, at Center, at Providence, and these other meetings that were steeped in anti-slavery sentiments. And so By 1778, 2 years after Philadelphia Yearly Meeting adopts an anti-slavery testimony, in 1776, North Carolina Yearly Meeting adopts an anti-slavery testimony. Part of that started out there in those plantations in the eastern part of North Carolina, as those Quakers couldn't in good conscience anymore hold enslaved persons. Woolman had visited there in 1757. And one of the people he visited, at least a member of the family, I don't know if he was visited directly, but Thomas Newby was affected by this. Thomas Newby had a slave plantation called Belvedere, gave its name to the local town of Belvedere, where all the True Bloods and Nicholsons and Whites and Winslows come from and settled around here. And Thomas Newby went to his monthly meeting in the early 1770s. I can't in good conscience anymore do this. And again, they didn't know what to do with it, but it took them only a few years because Philadelphia did this, the mother church, so they had an example. By 1778, North Carolina Yearly Meeting adopted an anti-slavery testimony. Now, one aside, a descendant of Thomas Newby still lives in that plantation house. And there are enough white hairs here, you might catch this. She married Wolfman Jack. And Wolfman Jack died of a massive heart attack in that house, and it's buried next door. Now, it has nothing to do with anti-slavery, but anyway, I want to get that little fact out. We have that connection to Wolfman Jack. Well, so you're anti-slavery in the slave South. What do you do with that? It's illegal to manumit their enslaved persons. North Carolina didn't want a bunch of free blacks around. Kind of like Indiana by the 1850s had adopted an amendment to its constitution. They didn't want the blacks in the state either. Only 4 counties in Indiana voted against that amendment, one of them being Randolph County, and the others were up there in the north where the Anabaptists were hanging out. But in North Carolina, you got a problem because it's illegal to manumit your enslaved persons. And Quakers held these slaves. You couldn't hold on to them and remain Quaker. Now, some chose to leave friends to hold on to their economic advantage, to hold on to their enslaved persons. Nathan Winslow, out there in Perquimans County, wanted to hold on to his enslaved persons, so he was disowned by his meeting, but he continued to worship. Disownment wasn't quite like Amish shunning. He continued to worship. He just couldn't represent friends or attend business meetings. And if you've ever attended a Quaker business meeting, that's not a real onerous punishment all the time. But he held on to enslaved persons into the Civil War before he manumitted them. One interesting family down in Guilford County, the Armfield family, and we don't know whether the Armfields left friends, this branch of the Armfields, over their participation in the Revolutionary War, because some Quakers fought on either side during the Revolutionary War, or because of slavery. But the Armfields left. And John Armfield was born just a few years before Levi Coffin to this formerly Quaker family in Guilford County, went on to be the largest, wealthiest slave trader in America. Franklin and Armfield, with offices up in Alexandria. So not everyone got on board, but most did. But they had that problem. What do we do? One of the first things they did was, well, legally, churches can own property. So almost 1,000, I've heard, Quakers turned title to their enslaved persons over to North Carolina Yearly Meeting. North Carolina Yearly Meeting was the largest slave owner in North Carolina because they held title to almost 1,000 enslaved persons. They were known as Quaker Free Negroes. They had their own agency. They had their own occupations. They had their own life. They were free, but if they were kidnapped or picked up, and this is a major problem, being kidnapped as a free black, they got documents. And we'll talk later on about how some of the Coffins worked with the court system with kidnappings. Well, that was one of the first things they did. But, you know, legislatures, especially pro-slavery legislatures, get around that. And so they had to figure out some other ways. One was colonization. Many Quakers were involved in colonization projects. Find those African Americans who wanted to go back to Africa, to Sierra Leone, for example, or down to Haiti. Well, that didn't work really well either, sometimes because of the situation there, the easily re-enslaved, unscrupulous sea captains who would sell their cargo. So many Quakers, like George Swain at New Garden, was president of the Colonization Society of Guilford County and left after he realized that wasn't working. So they started Manumission Society. Maybe we can convince people. And Quakers like Vestal Coffin and some of the Osborns down at Center meeting in 1814-15 started the state's first Manumission Society to convince people. Jonathan Lindley, Quaker from Orange County, North Carolina, became a member of the legislature and was trying to ram through legislation to prohibit slavery or the importation and selling and buying of enslaved persons. Didn't get much traction, so he packed up in 1811, left for Orange County, southern Indiana, with a long wagon train of Quakers. It may also be tied to the fact that the University of North Carolina was established on his farm, so maybe he had to get out of there, or maybe he was a Duke fan. I don't know, but he left. So what do you do? Well, that then spurs on the illegal activity of those enslaved persons who were finding sanctuary in the New Garden community. And if you've read the reminiscences, you know that long before there was an Underground Railroad, fugitives from slavery were hiding out in the New Garden woods because Quakers were known anti-slavery advocates. And if you couldn't tolerate the situation you were in, what did you do? You ran away, hoping the situation would change. And you went to these woods that were a sanctuary. And you built a little debris hut, or you dug a primitive cave in the embankments of Horsepin Creek, or the other creeks that ran through there, and you just hoped the situation would change. But by 1819, we have the first activity, what became known as the Underground Railroad. It wasn't known as the Underground Railroad yet because one major factor, there weren't railroads yet. But just before we get to that, I want to mention one of the other activities that was involved, and that was working with kidnapped free blacks to use the court system to get them out of there. One of the first cases in America, in fact, happened in Guilford County. Benjamin Benson was a free black living, I think, in Delaware, was kidnapped and sold to a businessman in Greensboro by the name of John Thompson. Not the basketball coach, but a businessman named John Thompson. Vestal Coffin, a cousin of Levi, who had helped establish the first Manumission Society, had petitioned the legislature. He was a known entity in the community. Enoch Macy, you're getting the drift here, Nantucket Quakers, and George Swain, another Nantucket name, learned about this case and learned that Benjamin Benson knew his rights and had gone to the court in Greensboro suing for his freedom. And these three New Garden Quakers went to bat for him. Well, John Thompson got spooked. He knew these folk meant business. They had done this before. And so he sold Benjamin Benson to an enslaver in Georgia. And these three New Garden Quakers kept working at it. And 3 years later, in 1820, Benjamin Benson was extradited back to Guilford County and was freed through the court system. One of the first times that happened in America. There were some prior to that. So this is happening. This is happening in New Garden. So what do we draw out of that and what shaped Catharine and Levi? Well, I want to mention about five specific things that I think influenced Levi to carry on this kind of work, even when he migrated up here in 1826. The first is what Michael Burkle, one of our colleagues at ESR and before that at Earlham, titled one of his books about John Woolman, using the title A Near Sympathy. John Woolman used this term to describe empathetic feelings. You have a near sympathy to something. Coffin had this at an early age, what I call a near sympathy. And it started with his dawning awareness of what the institution of slavery meant. When he was, there was a piece in the paper today based on the fact that Adrienne Israel, who sadly can't be here, and I were going to be here. Why would folk from Greensboro go up to the Levi Coffin Museum to talk about Levi Coffin? Well, because he came from there. And the front page article starts out in 1796, 7-year-old Levi Coffin saw a coffle of slaves going up the New Salisbury Road to be sold in Virginia. There's a minor problem with that. Levi Coffin was born in 1798. So unless he was very prescient, I think what happened, because Nancy's a very good reporter, is there used to be a historical marker on front campus at Guilford College, near where the Coffins were born, saying, near this spot, Levi Coffin was born in 1789. The historical marker person evidently was dyslexic. He was born in 1798. But I think Nancy, in doing her research at the last minute, because she, like the PAL item, works for a newspaper that's got maybe 3 people on staff, has to do everything. So she just Googled Levi Coffin. Up pops this historical marker, old historical, it's been corrected since then. 89, okay, he's 7 years, he did this. 1796. But anyway, he sees this coffle, this group of enslaved persons shackled at their ankles, shuffling up New Salisbury Road, today's West Ridge Road near our house. And he asks his father, what on earth is that? And his father explained slavery to him. He said, how would I feel if my father disappeared, if I were separated from my family? And he had this near sympathy at the age of 7 with this coffle of slaves. A second was his understanding, a visceral understanding of the violence of the system. This was a violent system. And, I mean, you see the picture out here. One day he was with his father down at the Yadkin River fishing for shad. And while they were fishing, he sees 2 enslaved persons being beaten by their enslaver with burning logs because they'd made some mistake. It made a little impression on this boy. This is a violent system. So a third was his direct experience with those who'd been enslaved. He had a job when he was a little boy. I don't think Joyce ever had to do this. Joyce, my cousin, grew up on a hog farm. They were wise enough to get out of dairy long before we did. But one of my jobs as a kid on the farm outside of Rocheville was when the sows were farrowing. Little quiz, what's farrowing? Enough farm people here having their babies. We let them out of confinement. Hogs are actually a clean animal when you let them out of confinement. And we let them run in the back side of the place, and they would make nests and raise their young in healthy conditions. But with 15 baby pigs lactating, you couldn't forage like you normally could. So I had to take gunny sacks full of corn back to the back side of the place and find the nests, dump them out, and then get the heck out of there, because there's nothing meaner than a nursing sow. And I almost bought the farm once, literally. But that was Levi Coffin's job as a little boy. His father, like other farmers in that part of the country, let their hogs run in the woods. Not only for that, but also because it's a cheap animal to raise. They fatten up on the nuts and all the stuff in the woods. So he would be given the task of carrying gunny sacks of corn back into the woods. He would find the nests of these sows, but what else did he find in the New Garden Woods? Fugitives from slavery. And he would then start bringing food back to them and sit in the woods while they ate his food and listen to the stories of why they were escaping. Why were they hiding in these woods? What were the conditions they were running away from? And what was that glorious hope of freedom that animated their spirits? That made an impression on this little boy. So that direct experience and the story and narrative that he heard. And then finally, the injustice of the system. And this came home to him again when he was very young. And I estimate he may have been 12 or 13 at the time. Again, you read about it in the reminiscences, but if you don't know the backstory, you might not understand the significance of it. You've probably read about Eid. Again, the story out here on the wall is about how slave auctions separated families. Mothers from children and husbands from wives. Well, Eid was an enslaved woman, married with children, and had just given birth to another child, enslaved by David and Rachel Caldwell. That name means nothing to you down here, but means everything in North Carolina. David Caldwell was Princeton educated, had come down to Greensboro to establish the first Presbyterian church, the Buffalo Presbytery. He started the first college in North Carolina, the Log College that trained generations of preachers and lawyers and teachers. And he was offered the first presidency of that little university that was started on Jonathan Lindley's property, UNC. But he said, at the time, I'm too old to get somebody who's younger. He was that respected. He was a super patriot, raised troops and funds for the Revolutionary War battles that were fought around there, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And he lived to be 95, and so he was still raising funds and troops for the War of 1812. At the time of this story, he's 85, the most revered man in North Carolina, and an enslaver. Their son has just gotten married. The wife is pregnant. They're going to go down and start a new home around Charlotte, far away from Greensboro, and they need domestic help. They're going to be far away from family. So David calls, take Eid. Yeah, she's property, take her. Eid hears this, begs them not to do this because she's got a husband, she's got children, she desperately doesn't want to be separated. She's property, she's going to do what they tell her. She pleads, and they will not relent. So what do? You take your nursing child and you run away. And where do you run to? The New Garden Woods. About 2 weeks there in the woods, they're both sick, they're both hungry, cold. What do you do now? Well, the reason you go to the Quaker woods is there are Quakers. So they go to the Coffin farmhouse. And of course, Levi's parents welcome them in. Of course, they've already violated the law by this time. But Levi, 12, 13 maybe, hears this story. Can't believe a minister of the gospel would do something like this. Isn't this a violation of everything that Christians talk about? So he tells his friend, I got to go confront the Caldwells. Well, that can't necessarily go well. For one thing, he's 12 years old, has minimal education, and this is the guy in North Carolina, Princeton educated, 85. Today, they're still naming institutions after the Caldwells in Greensboro. Caldwell Academy, there's Caldwell Park, there's Caldwell this and that. And if he blows the whistle on his parents, they can be in trouble. But again, in Quaker culture, if you've got a leading that's rooted and grounded in truth, your community sometimes supports you in that. And the parents say, sure. So I can't imagine what is going through his head for the 7 miles from his farm on Horsepen Creek to the Caldwell plantation. But he goes, confronts the Caldwells about this, and convinces them not to do it. It's just remarkable. And it's an amazing example of speaking truth to power. It doesn't depend on your age, your education, race, creed, color. It's are you rooted and grounded in truth, and do you have the will and the fortitude to do this? So I think that's another shaper, this sense of the injustice and lack of integrity of this system. And so it leads to his resolve. And you see right here in this quote, and it's all over his reminiscences and all over the walls around here too, that yeah, there's the law of the land, but it's in contradiction to human decency and God's law, and so we just chose to ignore the law. One of the ways they did that was to open up the little New Garden School. New Garden in North Carolina had a little school that looked exactly like the little parsonage next to the New Garden meeting here. That was the former school. They just brought their architecture up here. Levi and his cousin Elijah taught in that. Levi Coffin taught in that little school at New Garden. In 1821, they opened up that school on first day Sunday afternoons when they weren't using it to teach enslaved persons how to read the Bible. Now, it was a trick. It's against the law to teach enslaved persons how to read. You don't want a literate enslaved population. They can read The Liberator, they can read William Lloyd Garrison's writings, they can read the poetry of John Greenleaf Whittier, they can read maps, they can get out of there. So it's against the law. But Levi Coffin went to David Caldwell first and said, we're just trying to teach them how to read the Bible. Would you be willing to have some of your enslaved persons come to our Sabbath school? How could you deprive them of the benefit that you have from Scripture and for your children have from Scripture? It teaches humility, obedience. And so, oh, sure. What I'm convinced of, though, is that goes back to that encounter of 12-year-old Levi with 85-year-old David Caldwell. They formed a relationship. And I think this is important in peacemaking, in justice work. How do you build relationships that later on, the ripples can affect something like that? So David Caldwell allowed some of his enslaved persons to go to that school. It was so effective in teaching enslaved persons how to read that within a few months, other less enlightened slave owners shut that school down. And in the New Garden Cemetery, there's a marker for where that school stood with the names of the teachers on it. Most of them wound up in Indiana, including Levi, Elijah, Horace Cannon. We won't go into all of Horace Cannon's significance. Levi Coffin was a teacher. We'll get to him in a moment. He didn't make it out of North Carolina. He died on his 34th birthday, the same year that Levi left for here, 1826. So I think that's what shaped Levi. It wasn't just the community of those abolitionists and anti-slavery Quakers. It's those experiences that, again, you can read about in his reminiscences. Now, finally, we get to the Underground Railroad. Now, depending on who you read, you have the origins of the Guilford County branch of the Underground Railroad. If you read Levi Coffin's reminiscences, you get one version of the story. You read Addison Coffin's travels, you get another version of the story. Well, Levi's got a dog in the fight, and Addison's father was one of the conductors, so he's got his own slant. But one of the basic understandings historically is that in 1819, John Demery, and I'll get to what I discovered myself today, the answer to a mystery we've had down there, but John Demery was a free black living with his family in either northern South Carolina. There's a Demery community over in Horry County. We don't know if he was related to that, but either northern South Carolina or southern North Carolina. But he knew that as a free black, he was still in danger of being kidnapped. So he packed up his family and moved to New Garden to have that extra layer of protection. There are a lot of free blacks who moved into the New Garden community, purchased land, had farms along Horsepen Creek, right there among the Coffins and others. Well, one winter night, 1819, shortly after Demery's former owner had died, his sons decided, we're going to get our property back. You know, our father has deprived us of this inheritance. So they come riding into the New Garden community and find out where the Demery cabin is, ride up to the front door and yell out, pretending to have been out hunting and gotten lost. And Demery comes out the front door. They knock him out. Don't knock him unconscious, but tie him up with ropes. And his wife comes running out to see what's happening. They knock her unconscious. The daughter comes running out, and before they can knock her unconscious, Demery yells, "Run, get Vestal Coffin." This known entity who knows how to do this stuff, whose farm is very close by. He and Alethea had a 170-acre farm there along New Garden Road. She goes running through the night, finds Vestal Coffin, Levi Coffin's first cousin, stepping outside of their cabin to get a load of firewood. Here's what's happening, drops the firewood, doesn't grab his winter coat, but grabs a neighbor, and they go running back and intercept the kidnappers. And Vestal Coffin lets them know, I've done this. Benson, remember Benson? Remember all my work with the Manumission Society, with the legislature? And they get kind of spooked. They're not quite sure what to do. And meanwhile, the neighbor he's grabbed unties Demery's ropes, and Demery springs to freedom, and with bloodhounds literally on his tail, but escapes. And the kidnappers jump back on their horses and hightail it out of there. They just don't know what to do. But they'll be back. So Demery comes back to the Coffin cabin, and that night they plot his escape route. Now this is where I've got to talk to this historical site. The map out here has no route from Greensboro to here. There's a route up from Tennessee and Kentucky. There's a route from Greensboro up to Philadelphia. But the route from Greensboro went up 52 over the Blue Ridge to Charleston, West Virginia, along the Kanawha, down the Ohio to Cincinnati, and up to this town established in 1806 by 3 Randolph County, North Carolina Quakers. And that night, they mapped that route out. And 6 weeks later, Demery, by foot, arrives in Richmond, where he spends 2 years earning enough money to send for his family, who finally join him. Now, I've often been asked, now, what happened to John Demery? Well, I didn't know. I found out upstairs. 1825, the free black community of Cabin Creek is established outside of Newport by John Demery. D-I-M-O-R-Y, spelled down there, D-I-M-R-E or D-I-M-E-R-Y, but bound to be the same person. So we finally figured out what happened to John Demery. Although, when I show this, the slides that Adrienne had sent ahead, there's another mystery that we'll have to figure out. So anyway, the Underground Railroad starts. It's not called that yet, but Levi and Vestal are working with the free black community and the enslaved black community. Again, if you read the reminiscence, Hamilton Saul, an enslaved person, is ferrying people out. And until 1826, Levi's deeply involved with this. Vestal Coffin dies on his birthday in 1826, so he's out of the picture. And then Coffin comes up here. But it continues. This massive, if you read Fergus Bordewich's history of the Underground Railroad, Bound for Canaan, Underground Railroad and the War for the Soul of America. Chapter 4 is just about Guilford County. And he said it's remarkable because that's 450, 500 miles in the south. And enslaved persons have been kept illiterate. There are headhunters, bounty hunters in every town, vigilante groups. There are no roads. You got no GPS on your walking sticks. How do you get out of the deep south? You can't easily. But if there's a massive Quaker community working interracially with free blacks and enslaved persons, it works. And they got a lot out of here, between 2,000 and 3,000 through this home next door. But pretty soon, most of those abolitionists were gone. It's very difficult being illegal in the slave South and plying that trade. And a minority of those Quakers were abolitionists and active on the Underground Railroad. The majority were gradualists. And you probably know the story of his first cousin, Elijah Coffin, who became clerk of the yearly meeting and booted him off his committees because he was active in anti-slavery societies. So 1843-44, you have a split in the yearly meeting between anti-slavery friends, abolitionists, and the gradualists who say, well, just gradually wither away, but to immediate emancipation would destroy the economy. Have you ever heard that argument before? So we don't want to do that. So there was a minority to begin with, and most of them wound up here. But there's a remarkable story that I want to end my piece with, and you're probably glad I'll be ending too, about the free black family of Archibald and Levina Curry. Because this is kind of the untold story of what was happening in this massive interracial civil disobedience movement, which we keep telling people in Greensboro happened 150 years before those Woolworth sit-ins. Now, come on, you've got an International Civil Rights Museum in the old Woolworths. You tout this, you pour millions of dollars into it. Look what was happening in Greensboro. Well, it was New Garden back then, 7 miles away from Greensboro, so who cared? but anyway, this is significant. But the untold story, even in the Quaker community until recently, was that there's this free black family of Archibald and Vina Curry had a 12-acre farm along Horsepin Creek, in there amongst the Coffins and others. Arch was a free black, but died in the early 1830s, and Vina inherited those papers. Now, she's got children, somewhere between 8 and 12. I mean, she had a lot of kids and a 12-acre farm. She had to supplement her income. 1837, because all those Quakers were leaving the South, all the teachers and all the students, there weren't little monthly meeting schools left, so the yearly meeting established a boarding school, New Garden Boarding School. 7 miles from the nearest known sin of Greensboro out there. It's kind of like Taylor University, you know, proud 15 miles from the nearest known sin. But like most Quaker boarding schools out there in the country, and 25 boys, 25 girls, the first coeducational school in the South, opens in 1837. Vina Curry goes to work as a washerwoman at New Garden Boarding School. And while she's scrubbing away on her washboard, Hamilton Saul, some of the other members of the black community, escort young black men who match the description of Arch Curry, her late husband, out to New Garden Boarding School. And she interviews them. And she judges their character, because she's going to hand these papers off to them to get them to Indiana. And she's got to know that they're trustworthy enough to give those papers, sometimes to Levi Coffin, or to other Quakers, who then bring them back. She got 15 people out of the South, handing those papers off while she was washing away. That story wasn't part of the narrative for the longest time until Adrienne Israel was doing a bunch of research. She's mentioned in Addison Coffin's travels. She's mentioned in the reminiscences, but it's like another one of those books written by Earlham faculty. It was hidden in plain sight. So 2 weeks ago, Adrienne gave the keynote address as we unveiled an historical marker for Vina Curry on front campus, right next to Levi Coffin's historical marker. Amazing story. And Adrienne could have told it way better than I did. So I want to finish with that because the rest of the story isn't quite as happy down there, because by the time, and you know, by the time Levi Coffin and Hiram Mendenhall and those other abolitionists got up here and were booted out of the yearly meeting, even up here, the testimony of friends was, you can't be doing this illegal stuff. You know, we got to be the quiet in the land. You know, you can't join anti-slavery society. I was doing a research paper for Hugh Barber back in my graduate school days in 1973, doing research in the archives of New London Friends Meeting, where my family had been part of. And at that time, all the minutes are now in the archives at Earlham, but at that time, they're just in this safe in the basement of New London Meeting House. I'm reading these minutes about the Underground Railroad Act. That was one of the major stops on the Underground Railroad here, the New London, Western Howard County community. And I kept running across these disownments of people who were involved with slavery, so they were disowned, and people who had joined anti-slavery societies had been disowned. And I went to Hugh and said, what on earth is going? Well, by that time, you know, the Quaker elders were saying, we don't want you to call attention to us. You know, You're going to be mixing and mingling with non-Quakers at a time when Quakers are deep into kind of cultural isolation. We don't want you in there with Congregationalists and Presbyterians and Free Methodists and all those other kind of people, that riff-raff. And that was happening up here, and it happened in North Carolina too. But Vina Curry was washing away on her washboard and getting people out of there. So I want to finish with just a few slides that Adrienne would have been much better at articulating, so I'll just show them. There's John Demery, another one of the spellings, one of the 4 spellings. Now this is the other mystery. Okay, 1819, he gets here and works in Richmond for 2 years, sends for his family, establishes Cabin Creek in 1825, and she found this notice in the paper in Greensboro. The public are forwarded from suffering a certain mulatto man by the name of Moses, who calls himself John Demery, to pay, as I believe he has in his possession, my free papers. So what's going on there? Is someone else using that name? Did John Demery somehow get back? We don't know. Tom, do you know? David? Jim? We don't know. But anyway, another mystery. Maybe my next visit will solve it. Guilford County by race and status. There you can see the numbers. Now, what Adrienne would want to emphasize is look at how many free blacks there are in 1840. He said, and these people have their own agency. She really wants to emphasize that. These were not just people kind of living at the mercy of the Quaker community. They had farms, they had careers, they had trades, they moved freely, they had their own agency. And that's important to understand. And Adrienne would pound the pulpit on that one. Guilford County ads for runaway slaves. If you ever have the opportunity to go on the Register of Deeds website in Guilford County, like many other counties in North Carolina, I've done the slave papers, slave deeds of many of the counties. It's fascinating. Among those papers, they did a display at the Woolworths several years ago about the Slave Deeds Project. And there, in one of the displays, was a note of how Vestal Coffin, again, Levi Coffin's first cousin, had been asked by the North Carolina Yearly Meeting to purchase a number of enslaved persons with yearly meeting money for the purpose of freeing them in Indiana. There was that whole thing going on. Uproar in the 1840s, again, some of the advertisements she's found. North Carolina Yearly Minutes, whereas it is well-known testimony of the Society of Friends that they do not allow their members to hold slaves or in any way to interfere with the system of slavery further than by petition, reason, or demons, trance in a peaceable manner, but don't get involved in any illegal activity. More ads, more ads. And we got a false bottom wagon down there too. In the Mendenhall home place. And I posted that picture on in my Facebook a few weeks ago in kind of anticipation of coming up here. And someone said, well, you know, these are the people who, that's theirs. These are the people who owned it, the Stanleys. And they said, that wagon looks way too good to have made trips all the way from North Carolina with people. I mean, that really looks like a really good wagon. I said, well, it's kind of restored. They found the remnants of it in a Murrow barn across from the Center Friends meeting. Those Murrows, Edward R. Murrow, was raised in the Center Friends. His first public speaking at the age of 5 was rising out of the silence in the Center Friends meeting, confessing on the previous Lord's Day he had shot a rabbit. But anyway, let me end there. We've got time, I hope, for questions. So it's a Quaker gathering. We can't say fire away, but offer the leadings of your questions. Yeah.
Where would this free Cabin Creek?
Where is Cabin Creek?
So my understanding, the farmland between Modoc and Farmland, Indiana, in Randolph County is considered Cabin Creek.
Okay, so we're up in Randolph County.
Yeah.
There is a Cabin Creek.
There's an actual creek called Cabin Creek.
Yeah.
So that's along where those farms were sold.
One of the ways that Coffin and other conductors, Underground Railroad, got slave chasers off the trail was they knew where these free black communities were. Now, sometimes they would make sure that these runaways, these fugitives, would get to these free black communities. But up in New London, where Joyce and Terry and I, grew up, there was a Deer Creek free black community, and there was a Deer Creek white settlement, I think over in Grant County. But there were two Deer Creeks. One was free blacks, one was whites, but sympathetic Quaker abolitionists. And slave chasers came into New London. This was recorded in the New London Pioneer, an abolitionist paper in the 1840s and 50s. They went down to Westfield, settled by abolitionist Quakers from Westfield, North Carolina. Went down to Westfield to get the printing press to come up and start the New London Pioneer as an abolitionist paper. And the pro-slavery folk outside of Westfield didn't want that to get to New London. So Daniel Jones, the fine Quaker who was driving the wagon, so the New London Pioneer later on wrote, pulled his pistol out and let the mob know it was in their best interests to let the press go. I'm not going to shoot you, but I'm concerned for you. But anyway, in the paper later on, it talked about how these slave chasers were following these fugitives who were being hidden in New London, and knowing that these folk were on the way, they sent them on to Deer Creek, the white settlement in Grant County. Slave chasers came and said, where'd they go? Now again, Quakers aren't supposed to lie. So they said, we sent them to Deer Creek. So the slave chasers said, well, of course, the free black community, go to free black community, and they're not there. Now, of course, there's story after story after story. We have our own story. I sent it up to Jenny. I visited her grave just yesterday. Great-great-grandma Elizabeth, my great-great-grandparents, our great-great-grandparents were conductors in Clinton County, and they were hosting some fugitives. And it was, fortunately, just after supper, Grandma was upstairs with the fugitives and their own small children. Grandpa was down in the parlor. So the story goes. Now, you never know how much of this is true, but the story I heard from Aunt Tot, who heard it from Grandpa Robert, so it's, play telephone, it may be still accurate, but slave chasers come, knock on the door, Grandpa opens it, they got the papers, they got every legal right to search the house, but again, he can't pull the .30-06 off the gun rack and blow them away. That'd violate one Quaker testimony. He can't betray the enslaved persons. That'd violate another Quaker testimony. But he can't lie. That's another Quaker. Honesty, integrity. So he says, well, if you'll wait here in the parlor until my wife puts the children to bed, you can search the house. But right now my wife's putting children to bed, so stay in here. So, okay. Grandma hears it, gets the fugitives out through the second floor window onto the back porch roof. They shimmy down through the barnyard, through the pasture to the woods on their way to our Uncle Jimmy Stanley's house, the next station. Then she tucks the children in bed, yells down, "Dear, the children are in bed. You may send our guests up." So stories all over the place. Now here's one that I have to believe it's got to be apocryphal, but I read it sometime 30 or 40 years ago, and it's too good not to tell. So take it with a grain of salt. So the story goes, Levi Coffin is transporting two passengers in his false bottom wagon, heading up the road to the next station, and he's stopped by a slave chaser. He doesn't have the papers, but figures the Quaker's got to be honest. He's got to be able to answer honestly a direct question. What are you carrying in the bottom of that wagon? Now that day he had some clay pots. Now whether this is intentional or by accident, he says, earthen vessels. I'm just carrying earthen vessels. That's too good to actually be true. But who knows? But there are other stories about Coffin that are true, but that kind of stuff. But one of them was shipping them off to a free black community or not. Yeah.
I'm from New London.
Ah, yes.
I am a current member of the New London Friends Church.
Woohoo.
And about 10 years ago, we had some people come and wanted to look through our records because they wanted to document the Underground Railroad participation. And we let them look. There was nothing there to be found because it will say, shipped a load of clothing to such a place.
Yeah.
So that was what our records looked like.
Yeah, most of the records aren't going to divulge anything
No,
because it's illegal.
It's illegal.
Yeah.
You put your life in the
Yeah.
line.
The stories got told later. It's all on microfilm, the Kokomo Tribune now. They've got all the pioneer papers. And again, it's 20, 30, 40 years later. You don't know whether it's all, but yeah.
You're talking about the White Deer Creek, just south of the intersection of State Road 37 and 9 in Marion. There's a huge white home called the Sugar Farm, and that was a station.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh,
That
cool.
was George Sugar who was here first, and then that's where he moved.
Oh, cool.
It's privately owned. Don't
Yeah.
go knock on their door.
I know. When I was teaching at Eastern, our principal lived in that house.
Huh.
And so one Sunday, he invited the faculty to come in and check it out. And he had all the secret hiding places.
Oh my gosh.
I
Wow.
figured those out.
Cool. Well, that's a good story from Grant County. We won't go into 1930. Yeah, Tom?
Okay, two things. First of all, as regards Wolfman Jack, not only did he marry into a Quaker family, but he actually attended a Quaker school on Long Island very briefly before
Oh,
he
really?
was expelled. I'll direct you to his autobiography for the reason, because I won't repeat it next time.
Oh, cool.
Second thing, I'll complicate your narrative a little.
Oh, good.
Certainly by the 1840s, when there's a radical movement growing in the North for the immediate abolition of slavery, most yearly meetings of Friends caution their members against joining into it because it involves forming ties with non-Quakers and compromising some of the peculiar testimonies of Friends. At the same time, though, a lot of the prominent Friends who are worrying about, being unequally yoked with non-believers are willing to aid fugitive slaves. Good example of that over in Henry County, Spiceland friend named George Evans. He's the assistant clerk of Indiana Yearly Meeting. He's the author of a pamphlet about the dangers of joining anti-slavery societies. He's a leader in the Whig Party, yet he's also one of the people for whom we've got indisputable contemporary evidence of aiding fugitive slaves.
Neat. And I'll send you off to Tom's book, God's Government Begun, of those communities of progressive Friends like Hiram Mendenhall and others who were very abolitionists. Now, did any of those communities ever harbor fugitives?
Undoubtedly.
Yeah.
In fact, we've got a document from one of them in Logan County, Ohio, where a visitor sent them a questionnaire about, what do you do this, what do you do that? And one of the questions was, do you harbor fugitive slaves? And there was a simple one-word answer, yes.
Sounds kind of like how my great aunt Annis answered some of the questions on the 5 years meetings questionnaire about, are you worthy to be a missionary? She obfuscated a good deal. Other questions? Yeah.
I don't know if anyone knows, but I've always wondered, we had two teachers at Greensboro who were Coffins, two women, they're both sisters in Coffins, and nobody ever seemed to connect them with these Coffins, although they were from this area.
Yeah.
And I wondered if anybody knows. anything about those.
I don't know. The archives, the I don't know. But
I'm sure they were related somehow.
Yeah.
Levi's direct
Give me
descendants
their names.
moved away.
yeah. I know that one of Levi's first cousins wound up over in Park County because she wound up being a conductor on the Underground Railroad in Park County. It's a wonderful story. If we have time, I'll tell briefly. So those Coffins are all over but just because it's got a Quaker surname doesn't necessarily mean they were Quaker. Now, did any of you see the Ken Burns thing about Ben Franklin?
Yes.
One of the interesting things is to give you some sense that Ben never went full anti-slavery, and he knew that there was an anti-slavery movement going because he was in Philadelphia. And if you watch the documentary, Burns makes a point of he knew this was going on. So he made a choice. But Benazet and Woolman and Lay and all that was happening when Benjamin Franklin was there. Benjamin Franklin's mother was a Folger from Nantucket. But no evidence that I know of that she was a Quaker. Do you know, Tom?
No, I
Yeah.
don't think so.
Yeah. So not necessarily, but the coffin spread all over the place. And one of who was the guy who had the Crystal Cathedral? Robert Schuller. One of his right-hand people was T. Eugene Coffin. He made it all the way out to Southern California.
He was chairman of the board at George Fox.
Oh, was he? Yeah.
I knew him, yeah. He was
Yeah.
married to a Gene, so they called themselves a pair of Genes. And he was contemporary with my parents
Yeah.
in Oregon.
Yeah. Now, William Sloane Coffin was a Baptist, but probably had some sort of Nantucket ties too, I guess. Tom, again? We refer.
Well, I know T. Eugene Coffin was descended from one of Levi's uncles.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, Jim?
Yeah, a North Carolina question. We have a fair amount of documentation about the eastern North Carolina Quakers manumitting,
Mm-hmm.
and then some of those people being re-enslaved by the state seizing them and so forth. And then we sort of got a suggestion in your presentation of a Nantucket tradition from the 1730s that continues into North Carolina without any involvement in the Piedmont area of Quakers with slavery. And do you have some of those Nantucket families, you named 8 or 9 names,
Mhm.
involved with slavery in the 1740s and 50s?
Yeah.
And what do we know about the manumission effort in North Carolina right up to 1778 when North Carolina said, if you don't manumit, you can't be a member anymore?
Yeah. That would be a good question for Adrienne because she's read all those materials. Again, those here who may have read those materials themselves, again, because of where they came from, the Quakers in the Piedmont, and because of the topography, it's not plantation territory. There was slavery in Guilford County, clearly, but not a lot of evidence of Quaker involvement in it. But there were the arm fields. Well, we don't know whether the arm fields left friends because of slavery or because of the Revolutionary War, but John certainly got involved with it. But no, the major slaveholding was out there in the East. But we know some, like Nathan Winslow, held on to them. And again, the local connection, you probably know tons of Winslows around here. Who's one of the most famous Winslow families in Indiana history? James Dean's aunt and uncle. Yeah, yeah. Because you grew up
I
right
would
in
have known
the,
that.
you're probably related to half of them
No,
too.
not that I know of.
But anyway, the story of the Coffin cousin out in Park County. Some of you here may have known Edith Mackey. She just died 12 years ago at the age of 104. Very active in friend circles, and we knew her very well. Her grandparents were conductors, and her grandmother was a first cousin of Levi Coffin. They had a station out in Park County, I think north of Bloomingdale. And as a little girl, Edith loved to crawl up in her grandmother's lap, tell me the story of the little black girl and the little slave girl. And she would tell the story that out there on the frontier, they had a log cabin, 1850s. There was a knock on the door, and she could remember the Underground Railroad knock. Again, if you're kept illiterate, you've got to have all kinds of oral directions. You know, if you reach a fork in the road, what Yogi Bear would say, take it, but you're traveling at night, you come to a fork in the road, taking the right fork, or the correct fork, is a matter of life and death. You know there's a nail 3 feet above the ground on the side that you take. So the original tree huggers, you go up, 3 feet, you hit the nail, that's the fork you take. They're all kinds. The New London Pioneer talked about hand signals that people had to let people know there's someone coming. But there was a knock, because you need to know, are these slave chasers or are these fugitives? It was 3 loud bangs, long pause, 2 loud bangs. They heard it, opened the door, and there was a group of fugitives. One of them, a young woman visibly pregnant, who gave birth that night to a little girl they called Amy. Well, they stay there for 24 hours, sleeping, refreshing, getting food, but they got to get to Canada because of fugitive slave law. And they said, we can't make progress with a newborn. Would you keep this newborn until we get to Canada? Trail goes cold, we'll come back and get her. I said, sure. Off they go, and they never came back. They raised Amy as their own child. She went to the Quaker meeting, went to the Quaker school. She was a godsend. They'd just lost a little girl, and here she came. So at turn 16, she wanted to go find her birth family. They gave her, by now there are trains, they gave her a train ticket, and off she goes to Canada, finds her father, learns that her mother had died before they got to Canada. He's remarried, has a family, writes back, I want to stay here. And I said, well, sure, but maintains that connection all through her life. Edith Mackey, a white woman we knew, grew up with a black aunt, born in slavery, and was able to communicate those kind of direct experiences to us. But yeah, it's our Coffin cousin, yeah. Others, we've got another 5 minutes maybe.
I've got a couple.
Okay.
But we are the Levi and Catharine Coffins
Yeah.
historic site, so I just want to emphasize. But my question is, any reflections with Catharine and her upbringing or her family, or because we don't have Catharine's
Yeah.
perspective, we just have how people reflect on her. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that I'm sorry, I don't know. She was a white. I assume there are connections of the whites out there in Perquimans. Tom, do you have some materials on Catharine?
Yeah, actually, her white ancestors and Stanton ancestors had been enslavers in eastern North Carolina, and I've seen accounts by some of her cousins about even after the whites had manumitted their slaves, that some stayed with the family and worked as paid servants. And so, she very well may have known black people who had previously been white family slaves.
Okay. I have more information about Alethea. That doesn't help you any, but Alethea, the widow of Vestal, the first known conductor, survived his death in 1826 and inherited a 170-acre hardscrabble farm and 4 small children. She didn't have enough money to get to Indiana, but when she finally did, they packed up their possessions on a wagon and started off for Indiana. And she hopped out of the wagon because it was too bumpy, and she walked all the way to Indiana. Hated it, and came back, and was the matron of the women's side of the boarding school. Children grow up, they come up here, and eventually say, Mom, come on, you got to get out of there. So she finally goes, okay, fine. Comes up here. I think she's matron of the women's side of the Earlham, I think. Had a great way of making the girls behave because she knew all their family from North Carolina. Eventually retires and stays up here with her grown children, but with the understanding that when she dies, she's to be returned to the side of her husband. 65 years a widow. She is transported 1891 to the New Garden Cemetery. We got her story here. And resides there. Now on Vestal Coffin, first conductor, there's this lengthy epitaph about how wonderful he is and how his widow, Alethea, so it's obviously been put there years later, how his widow Alethea mourns for him still. And on her plain stone, for the longest, all I could see was died in Indiana. You dig down far enough, and it says buried in her wedding dress.
Oh, wow.
I always get that reaction, especially from the women. Oh, sweet. Well, number one, if you're walking back and forth to Indiana, you're going to fit in your wedding dress. Yeah. Yeah, but keeping it, yeah. Yeah, Tom?
One other thing, Mike mentioned about Alethea. She had a very famous photograph taken of her at her spinning
at her
wheel.
spinning wheel.
And
It's in here.
we were recently able to acquire that spinning
Really?
wheel from a great-great-great-granddaughter who was an Earl descendant. And
Oh,
arranged
cool.
her to come back here to the Coffin House to be displayed.
There she is, at her spinning wheel. Yeah. Cool. Other stories, corrections, additions?
I just have one question.
Yeah.
Again, this may be a stretch or something, but when you read about a person after 5 years and you start having these thoughts, but do you think there was sort of a brotherhood between Vestal and Levi? I mean, Levi was an only son, right? And, is there something about Vestal that he sort of latches onto? Or is it more of...
Well, what he described, it, we were brothers in the fight.
Right.
Yeah.
So I just didn't
Yeah.
know if that's just a...
Well, they lived close together.
Yeah.
I mean, it was when you read early Quaker community, I mean, it was tight knit. Look down the road at the folk wearing the broad brims and the plain clothing, and it's kind of a distant mirror. In fact, it's fascinating that many of the same reasons that brought the Quakers from North Carolina here, that the Amish are buying land from, because the Quakers have disappeared, are the very same ones: economic and religious principles. Same things. It's quite fascinating, just kind of a distant mirror of two plain peoples. Yeah.
I'm just going to offer what might be a different possible scenario, and that is that the majority of freedom seekers finding their way out of enslavement never met or saw a Quaker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that mostly the freedom seeker network that eventually got called the Underground Railroad was something that happened in the black community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
With the AME and the Baptist and other AME Zion and other churches providing a backbone of that institution.
Mm-hmm.
And to expand it even further, in 1689, the King of Spain said, people enslaved by the English can come to Spanish Florida, and we have free black towns. And if you convert to Catholicism, we'll give you we'll give you arms, and you can go and help people escape from the Carolinas to Florida. So we have a southbound freedom seeker network. Long before 1829, Mexico says we're no longer a country that allows slavery, and 1833, Canada does the same. So wherever people are enslaved, they resist.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes that resistance takes the form of escape. A lot of escape just means not going far from family, going to a nearby hiding place and staying nearby, or the swamp or some place. And sometimes it meant going a distance. But some part of the significance, I think, of Quakers, if we'd take a word from a little later in that century, of propaganda of deed, and that is the Quakers were the most open part of the Freedom Seeker Network, which eventually got called the Underground Railroad. And the propaganda of deed was, by doing what they were doing, morally undermining this institution of holding humanity in bondage. And that there were many other faiths. There were Free Presbyterians, there were Wesleyan Methodists,
Right.
there were Free Will Baptists, many other largely white interfaith, it was an interfaith network as
Yeah.
well. But Quakers we were visible because of how we talked and how we dressed.
Mhm.
And we got a lot of the credit for it, but partly that was intentional because of propaganda of deed in undermining this institution. And so much of what we think about as this Freedom Seeker Network comes from those last 2 or 3 decades prior to the Civil War.
Yeah, it's important.
But in
yeah.
fact, we can look back to 1689 when people were going to Florida and forming, and not just to Spanish towns, but also the Seminole Indians, which
Yeah.
was a coalition of different surviving tribes came together, and then they said, well, we'll accept black bands within our nation.
And so the Tuscarora in North Carolina.
And so, this is a much bigger picture than the Quaker view of the Freedom Seeker networks that got called the Underground
Yeah.
Railroad.
And that's important in the
Yeah.
broader history. And of course, tonight's focus was
Yeah.
why North Carolina here. And again, I want to emphasize that as Fergus Borderwich does, that it was remarkable that it worked the way it did there, but it was because of this massive interracial civil disobedience movement and this Quaker community there. But you're right, and too often Quakers take credit for the Underground Railroad when, it was way bigger. And one of the things that I first learned when I first went to Philadelphia and heard about the Germantown Remonstrance, and there was a big historical marker on Germantown Avenue in front of the former home of Toombs Cooners, where it's written, and it was described as the first protest against slavery in North America. And Michael Van Hoy said, I doubt that. My guess is the enslaved persons were protesting it too. Yeah, thank you. I know we're there, and
Thank you, Matt.
well, thank you very much.